Welcome, everyone, to this Sierra Club Maine webinar with Dr. Susana Hancock. I'm Halsey Snow. I'm a volunteer activist with Sierra Club in Maine, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Hancock. Dr. Susana Hancock is a glaciologist, climate policy expert, and polar skier. She graduated with an undergraduate degree from Connecticut College and holds 3 graduate degrees from the University of Oxford in the UK. She works with the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, that's the ICCI, as the Global Mountains Director, where she focuses on driving climate ambition and urgency within the UN process and across global governments. Susana is also known for her glacier expeditions, where she studies pollution in polar ecosystems and uses these findings to inform global climate policy. She is on local and international environment and polar research boards, including Wolf's Neck Center in Freeport, where she lives when she's here in the US. Thank you for being with us, Susana, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate Halsey for the invitation to join. And I'll just say that we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end, but if there's anything that I say that sparks any questions or curiosities, please do interrupt and just unmute yourselves and say, because I may or may not see a question and I probably won't read it. So just interject if it's relevant. So yeah, thank you so much. So yes, as Halsey said, I work at the nexus of climate science and diplomacy, really. Basically, this means that I try to take science and see how I can use it to affect policy in both UN and adjacent systems. I have now been on 7 expeditions, mostly to the glaciers and the ice sheets. So the ice sheets are the big chunks of ice covering Antarctica and Greenland. But also, I just had my first research expedition to tropical glaciers in January as well. And there we go. Okay. So tropical glaciers may seem a little bit of a misnomer. Most of us probably don't think about ice when we think about the Caribbean or Indonesia. Yet 7 countries that are on the equator actually have glaciers. These are in South America, Africa, and in the Pacific. This ice here is particularly vulnerable to the changing climate now and is really only surviving because of being at high altitude. So here, for example, this was my trip in January, and I'm at about 17,000 feet in that picture in the upper left, where I'm actually on the snow. And these other pictures were just marking the terminus of the ice in different decades as it's melting really rapidly. This particular region has melted about 90% of its ice in the past 150 years. And the ice here is particularly relevant and important because it really feeds about 70% of the country's population. And we're starting to also look in, climate issues, glaciers, ice, water resources. They don't respect national borders as well. So policies that are in one place really affect other places. So primarily, I'm going to share a bit about my expedition last autumn across Greenland, and then a little bit of what I did with this, because that's what Halsey had asked me to do. But I'm happy to, again, if there's questions that come up, please do ask. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of group participation. Sorry, I'm sure that's not what you all signed up for, but just 30 seconds or so. Why is what when you think about the Arctic or glaciers or ice sheets, what stands out? Any thoughts? Like, why would this be an interesting area? Okay. So glaciers affect 85% of the world's populations. The world's countries. We talk a lot about sea level rise. Most of that's not from the actual mountain glaciers, but from the polar ice sheets, a little bit from the glaciers. Changes in vector-borne diseases around the world. We impact the base of the food chain. We have heat stress, increased wildfires. In the Arctic, we have something called zombie fires. Zombie fires are fires that actually can overwinter and they continue to burn underneath the snow and ice into the permafrost, and then they reemerge elsewhere in the spring. loss of biodiversity, food, water, political insecurity. So if you think about big conflicts around the world, there's often a climate point to them, and even human trafficking. So these are sort of the big issues that we look at, or I look at when we're talking about the loss of ice. So this here is the Paramo, and this again is a photograph I took in Colombia. It also, well, it's also sort of one of those side issues of ice. You can actually see the tallest glacier in Colombia right behind it, a little bit in the background. But this is basically a glacier-fed ecosystem in the cloud forests of the Andes, and it's one of the most biodiverse regions, heavily endangered, and it's directly downstream of the glaciers, so it relies upon them, and it is sort of a sponge for the country. It supplies water from the glaciers, and then these tree-like things can actually absorb water from the clouds, and it supplies water to about 70% of Colombians there. So just an example of, when we're talking about ice, it's not necessarily exactly the ice. That said, to me, icy regions really exemplify how interconnected we are globally, especially when I'm on some of the world's, the big ice sheets. I feel very far away. Often, there's no contrails in the sky, certainly no phone connection, no internet, no other people other than people with whom I am. Very, very hard to get a rescue in many places if one were needed. Zero infrastructure. And I don't know I'll just change that if you were seeing all the participants. So so I've been stuck on rapidly melting ice in the past. I've had tent snapping with the poles breaking when, weeks away from civilization, having to try to figure out how to pitch a tent again or repitch a tent if it's crashed in a Category 3 hurricane, for example, having to bury myself in the snow if it's really much windier than that. Deciding, how am I going to handle multi-day blizzards and whiteout conditions when I'm in one of the most polar bear dense regions of the world. So lots of different things that come into play in these places. But for me, the Arctic is really just an incredible and fascinating place. So this is Greenland, and this is Greenland specifically last July, mid-July, right before I was going to head over there to ski across it. The red is melt. So this is the part of Greenland that was actively melting at that time. Greenland's melt at this point was about 33 million tons per hour of ice. So to quantify that, in case anybody is calculating, that's about 17 milliliters of Martinelli's sparkling cider per second. So really rapid melting. The Arctic itself, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a highly vulnerable melting area. On average, overall, it's melting about 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. In some areas where I've been doing work more recently, it's about seven times faster. And we know that at this rate, by the end of the century, we're going to lose about half of the world's glaciers. And with that, fresh water and water resources for billions, for 1.2, maybe up to 2 billion people around the world. In the high mountain regions of the Hindu Kush Himalaya, where a lot of the land ice is, it's possible that we can lose as much as 80% of that if we keep our current emissions levels. So just a little bit of stats. Don't need to really read these too much, but the point is that we do know that we can save more than half of the world's glaciers if we keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees rather than our policy aligned pathways of 2.7. So this is just showing different regions of the world and the ice and how much would remain. So we can see that, even some of the smaller places, Iceland, the Rockies, Scandinavia, we're really committing to ice loss, at 2 degrees. So for Greenland, I have probably been obsessed with Greenland for maybe 20 years. And so, as I said, last fall, skied across it in what they call man hauling, which is basically pulling everything self-powered in a sled. So there's my sled behind me that had everything I needed to survive for about 6 weeks. And if you think back to the picture of melt And, that red area, that was July. This picture is September and mid-September, but you're all Mainers. You know what qualities of snow are and what they look like. You can see a lot of moisture there. And so you'd be correct if you think that it's pretty wet. So Greenland is, we were not expecting it to be as wet and warm as it was, certainly in as much melt. But it is a place that we've already committed a lot of melt due to current destabilization of the ice sheet as a result of ongoing emissions. So what this means is that even if we were to stop all emissions already, they'd be gone. We've already committed a minimum of 3% of the ice sheet. And I know 3% doesn't necessarily sound like too much, but when you look at a place as big as Greenland, that's actually over 10 inches on average of sea level rise around the world. And when we say 10 inches on average, you have some place like Greenland that is actually going to see seeing sea level decrease because the land is sort of rebounding from the weight of the ice. You can add in your ocean physics and gravity, and where you end up seeing the majority of sea level rise is in places that are already exceptionally vulnerable to it, such as in the Pacific and the more tropical regions. So this 10 inches average is a global average. So some places might see 20 inches and some places are going to see, a sea level decrease. So rivers, this was also a picture I took in mid-September. It's a little bit hard to, scale there, but this river is probably 150 feet across this river sort of bank here and about 100 feet down to the water, and the water was moving quite quickly. So this is something that we were not expecting to come across these. And when you're skiing across, we sort of mapped our route a little bit, do a little bit old style, had some little manual compasses and literally just walking across the ice sheet, following our little red arrow in the direction that we had established. But coming across a river like this that we were not expecting, and we can't go through it. Some of the smaller rivers we can. I did try to use my sled as a kayak a little bit. It's with moderate success. May have fallen in the river at one point, but I won't talk about that. But that, something like that becomes could become quite a big emergency because you get the risk of hypothermia and nothing dries in the really cold environments. So, you end up having to, when you come across a river like this, we actually have to walk around it, and you're trying to figure out where's the mouth of where's sort of the start of the river, the tributary streams, but also where does it end? And these rivers usually end in what's called a moulin. And a moulin is a French word for mill. And it's basically a shaft in the ice where the water finds a weakness and it goes down to either the base of the glacier or some intermediate areas to figure out what the easiest way for it to get to the water is. And when it gets down to the base of the glacier, that lubricates the ice and it accelerates melting as well, and that can increase crevasses and rip open the ice much more quickly. So in the crevasses, areas about the size of the pyramids of Giza are opening in Greenland every few days, and then you've got the accelerated melt of all of these gashes that water can then flow more easily down, and it's contributing about half of the annual melt of Greenland is just through the crevasses. So that's me in the middle there, and then flanked by a teammate who's we're trying to contemplate how to actually get off the glacier, off the ice sheet. You can see the land in the background, and it felt a little bit like a rat in a maze, trying to find some cheese, trying to figure out how we can get through and how we can get around. The benefit, I guess, of going at this time of year in the fall is that we can actually see all of these crevasses. Definitely, I did step into one that I didn't see because we end up with snow that will cover crevasses. And in the spring, when I've been on expeditions in the spring, we tend to be a lot more careful around crevasses because you don't know where they are. The snow covers them. And in the winter, early spring, it's sort of okay if there's enough snow. It's pretty safe to walk over them. But as the melt season really kicks off, the snow weakens and thins, and you end up not seeing the crevasses until really you fall in through the snow into them. So we have a huge benefit of being able to see all of these, but it also makes it a lot more challenging to go around. And so consequently, in an area where we're very concerned about the potential for crevasses, especially when we can't see them, we're wearing harnesses, and ropes and really tied onto each other. So,
Question, Susanna,
yes,
from the chat. Do
I'll
you
let you
ever
read it.
travel with a drone so you can see your
Yes and no.
surroundings from afar?
Yes and no. Um, yes, I've traveled. I've done a few trips with drones, and I usually just do it for photography.
Hmm.
I know I have friends who do it to scout out routes. I
Hmm.
have always found it a little bit more fun to try to have to figure out the route for myself and to try to read the snow and figure out a path so that I'm going and it's sort of trial and error. I've liked that. But certainly there are people who will plan out exactly where they're going to go based on what the drone is showing. I have, that said, certainly used satellite imagery and can get some direct satellite imagery as well and work with some meteorologists on that as well when trying to figure out if certain things are specifically safe. So when I've been out on the sea ice, for example, where we actually seeing sea ice, where is it ending? I did that a lot when I did an attempt to get to the North Pole, for example, and we had huge questions about the sea ice, and it was rapidly moving. So I've done it when it's a sort of an important safety thing, but when it's a matter of convenience, I've tried to stay away from it. But that's just a personal preference. But absolutely, their drones are used fairly frequently for things like that. I just don't like the mosquito buzz if I can avoid it. So just a personal preference.
Yeah.
Um, and then also because of the extreme warming, melt, we, even into the fall, we would start packing up camp at about 2 in the morning to start skiing. So here we are in the dark. This is Greenland. It does get dark in September. And so we would start skiing in the dark for a few hours and then the sun would rise. And this meant that by, midday, early afternoon, when we had put in a full, say, 10 hours of skiing, we could stop and pitch tents. The benefit of this was that at that time the snow under, especially when it was, we mainly did this when it was really sunny, and the snow would get kind of sloshy and it would be a little bit sludgy to ski through, so it wasn't as much fun. We weren't making the progress we wanted to make. I'm out there and it's not really warm objectively, but we're doing a fair bit of heavy exercise for this, so overheating ourselves and it's just not very comfortable. But the other benefit is that we'd pitch tents and they could bake in the sun for a few hours, which could dry things out and also gave us a little bit of ambient heating. So, your tent might get up to, say, 60 degrees, which if it's 0 outside in the sun is remarkably warm. Overnight, we were getting temperatures of 40 below or so, and so that gets quite hard because you're waking up and trying to get yourself out of a cozy sleeping bag, and getting going in the dark and the cold. On the same track, the importance of keeping hydrated just to feel well and performance. I often had to get up and pee once or twice in the middle of the night. Really not much fun when, again, it's really cold outside. And, uh, but I often had the northern lights in the middle of the night. So that was really rewarding. And so that kind of took away that inconvenience a bit. So this is me in a crevasse intentionally this time. But here, this was in Iceland, and the other picture is of a friend of mine, teammate in Svalbard, where we're both looking for PFAS, so something that's very familiar to us in Maine. We've got PFAS all over the world. It was really a startling feeling for me to realize that I'm melting snow in 200 miles from the North Pole, for example. People aren't there, no factories around, whatever. And the snow that I'm melting actually is contaminated with PFAS, and that's what I'm about to be drinking. It's like, well, if snow here, if it's in the middle of Antarctica, isn't clean, where is? So it was just really emphasizing to me of how humans, how much we've impacted really impacted the world around us, and some of our worst bits are really everywhere. Uh, Greenland itself, nanoplastics, really heavy in those, about 13 nanograms of nanoplastics per milliliter of snow and sea ice, seawater, sediments collected from the ocean floor around. Oops, I took out that picture. I was going to have pictures of some of that, but I guess I took that out. So some of this is from local sources, and some of it is from, so local sources, not immediate local, but say fishing in the area. So it might be a couple 100 miles away, for example, gets into the ocean. Fishing line decays. In this place in Svalbard where I took this photo, the birds were dying. There was a certain species of bird, about 90% of them were dying from plastic ingestion. So seeing a lot of that. It also transports in the air. So black carbon from somewhere like Asia takes about a week or so to get to the high Arctic. And because of the ocean and atmospheric currents, it gets there, and it pretty much stays for a bit. So yeah, some pieces are these nanoplastics, but some are also, larger than I am, for example. So I'll talk a little bit about what I do with some of this and how we get into the policy side. So as was said earlier, I work for this organization called the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, both in glacier science and in policy. And as part of that, we host the secretariat for this group called Ambition on Melting Ice, which is a high-level group looking at sea level rise and mountain water resources. And this comprises members from all negotiation groups in the UN blocks, apart from those that are pro oil. And our big thing is, as you can look from this, these are sort of our core members right here. But we've got Palau, Vanuatu, Liberia, Samoa. These aren't necessarily glaciated places or polar places. So our big interest is looking at what are the impacts that we're seeing in these places, in these polar and glaciated places. So the impacts of, well, sort of the melt in these places, but then what are those actual impacts on the rest of the world? So again, when we're talking about glaciers, we're not talking about just the countries that have glaciers. We're talking about countries that are impacted by glaciers. And that, again, is, as I said at the beginning, 85% of the world's countries. So yeah, so we're looking at not just the loss of ice in Antarctica, but the 250 million people who are going to lose their houses in the next 3.5 decades as a result of sea level rise. We're looking at the destabilization of land as a result of changes in permafrost, for example, not just sort of the science of permafrost thaw. So these are the 25 countries we work with specifically closely, but have another 15 that I'm pretty tight with as well. So we do several things with this. One is we bring negotiators to the ice, to these regions of what we call the cryosphere. So the cryosphere being the cold, frozen regions of the planet. So this was a trip to Iceland with several different countries represented there. And what was especially interesting here is that you can see on this picture, we've marked out where the ice was, say, 20 years ago. So a lot higher and a lot farther out. And so this is just an area of rapid retreat. So just showing what's going on in different parts of the world, sort of pick a different region that's impacted in some capacity by ice loss, whether it's in that region, such as here, or whether it's a downstream area, and really make sure that negotiators and decision makers, presidents of countries, are really understanding what's happening rather than just sort of a textbook knowledge where somebody said, this is what's going on and therefore you should care about it. Much of our time here, though, is based on preparing for the big negotiations. So here's a couple pictures of those rooms. And these are from some of the big sort of UN COP meetings. So Brazil last November for COP 30, if that sounds familiar to anyone. These meetings happen twice a year. So there's the big COP meeting, and then there's a spring meeting. And we have negotiation tracks across a range of different subjects. I'm personally involved in have been involved in about 7 of them. So we've got tracks in finance, adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, Earth systems responses, science, etc. And so as you can see here, these rooms often form an area where we are in various sizes depending on who's going to be there and how many negotiators or ministers, and whether it's one per country or two per country. Different size rooms with big screens, and often that's exactly what it looks like in that left picture. It's a Word document, and we are going word by word and editing that document and trying to get all 195 countries, or those who have representation in these rooms, to actually agree on the text, which is a bit of a challenge. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's a challenge more than it might appear to be a challenge first off in a minute. The US has been absent. This is a picture I took at the spring meetings last June, and also an updated form of the EPA, which talks about climate change, but doesn't mention anthropogenic impacts or oil or anything of that sort either. But there was an empty seat from the US. They had said they were going to show up, and then they didn't, which is the same thing that happened in the fall as well. And so, but even though while the US wasn't there, and now that basically Trump announced his decision to leave Paris, but that decision takes a year to take in place. So there were 2 rounds of negotiations. The US still was full party to Paris Agreement before it withdrew. So we're not allowed, we couldn't go now, but could have gone last year. So even though the US wasn't there, its presence still very much is felt, and it certainly impacted party decisions and country positions. So the US works on a consensus model. Sorry, the UN. The UN works on a consensus model for the UN climate only. So the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so it works on this consensus model rather than a majority model. And that means that they only really need one country to say that they're not interested or to nix something for it not to go through. And one of my negotiation tracks on mitigation, this has happened in the last 6 or 7 rounds of these conversations. We get to spend 2 weeks hammering something out. We get to the end, and some country, usually always an oil producing country, says, nah, not feeling it. And they do what was called an Article 16, which basically says, we're going to scrap any conversation we had, any progress that we made, and start over in another 6 months. And so we've been doing that in this one negotiation track for a couple of years now, and incredibly frustrating with that. So, but it is exclusively because we have this consensus model that all other UN groups and many other groups, when they talk about climate or talk about other issues, do not have. So it's a majority. One benefit of this, I guess, is that it gives every country an equal vote. So Fiji could shut something down just as easily as India or Saudi Arabia. It just doesn't really happen that way too much. But this was sort of a agreement made in the very early days of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process 30 plus years ago, led perhaps unsurprisingly by Saudi Arabia and other OPEC, the oil producing countries. So this has led, as you can probably imagine, to sort of this weaponization of science, where it gets a lot harder to agree on text and what should be in there and what shouldn't be there. So I think I've got a couple more minutes that I was told to speak. So I'll just show a little bit of what we're seeing in that weaponization of science and how, yes. So this is from SB 62, and SB 62, the SBs are the non-COP meetings, the spring meetings. So this was from Germany last June, and just showing a draft text on the left there, the 19th, and then a finalized text on the 26th of June. And this, so basically this is also in the research and systematic observation, so the main science track, which is usually the least contentious. So a couple things in these 2 paragraphs. One is the draft text that we started off with said Substa, which is basically the chairs of the UN climate group for this conference, noted with alarm and utmost concern, and it was translated to noted the information. So taking out any kind of urgency to that meaning. And then we have ocean heat content and sea level rise reach the highest levels on record, with the Arctic and Antarctic sea ice extent were below average, with increasing glacier mass loss and extreme events. And that went to both slow onset and extreme events. So anybody who's really familiar with what they mean when they talk about slow onset and extreme events knows that that has to be ice sheets. That has to be something that has potential to have huge impact in the future. But we're not actually saying what the problem is. And then lower down, every increment of warming goes to global warming. And then this section about remains below the temperature remains below 1.5 degrees and therefore below the Paris Agreement temperature goal went to a footnote saying that the estimate of level of warming of 1.5 degrees, but we can't actually rule it out. And the point of not being able to rule it out has been part of this argument from the fossil fuel countries that if we're basically going to hit 1.5, why are we even bother talking about it? Just throw out that whole goal and say that we've missed it and let's just, move on. Whereas everybody else is saying, well, all right, we've got to figure out what we're going to do about this overshoot, or, back up to 1.5 isn't 2 degrees or scrap it. It's, 1.51 and then figure out how do we get back. So that's sort of when we talk about the weaponization of science and what we're seeing in these negotiations. That's really what we see. So, we try with the groups of countries that we work with is really strategizing this, helping countries understand what these impacts are, what the relationships are. So, I think in this mitigation track, which is, I said this one here is the science track, but in mitigation, which is the one that we've stalled out for the past couple of years, every 6 months, we actually last June at the same meeting had a 45-minute let's all get together and define a safe space. What does it mean for us to be able to talk to each other? Because there was just so much disrespect and countries that were just tarking over people and shouting at people and trying to prove everybody wrong. And it's just, really not great. But it meant that it's just been a really hard negotiation track to move forward. So it was decided in June that we really need to have this parallel process and say that, okay, we're not actually making progress here. Do we need another negotiation track to talk about sort of the just directly cut right to the phase out of fossil fuels, or do we need a separate process? And it was decided, let's have a separate process at least to get started. So, and it's especially hard for me in these areas because, I'm seeing the downstream impacts. I'm seeing the upstream impacts of this rapid melt and seeing it very personally and, having to call for rescue because the sea ice is literally disintegrating much more quickly than I was expecting. But seeing the impacts of that, but also seeing how it's causing disasters. I've been in areas where we've been monitoring for these disasters, developing warning systems for these disasters, especially recently in the Himalayas or in the past year, I've been in them in the Himalayas and the mountains in Central Asia and the Caucasus, looking at these because we'll have basically glacier outburst floods that can wipe out villages and infrastructure without almost any warning, something that happens maybe within an hour or two, and very poor warning systems to let people know. So, and certainly sea level rise that's already impacting a lot of people. So this is back to Colombia here. It's just some pictures I took when I was there. So I went on this expedition, but part of the other reason for the expedition is that at the meeting last year in June, when we were talking about big frustrations on the mitigation and the need for the parallel process, was they decided to have what they're calling the first international conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. And it's going to be co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands. Will be part of a forthcoming series. Tuvalu is currently in sort of a tripartite relationship with Colombia and the Netherlands to host the second one, likely next spring, but that's very TBD at the moment. And the idea is basically to figure out, okay, this whole consensus model isn't working. Everybody's frustrated. How do we actually get involved? How do we pull together the countries who really want to make progress on this and move forward? So luckily, I believe all of my countries that I work with are part of that. So I'm working with them on this. But went down to Colombia for this expedition, but also to start working with the government on this, just because I have all those the political ties in the government. So they invited me down to help form what they're calling this coalition of the willing. So that's 97 countries that have been invited so far to come together and figure out what needs to happen for the world to transition away from fossil fuels. How can that happen in a way that's inclusive? Because different countries have different capacities, different abilities, different interests. Many countries that are most impacted have fewest resources or very few resources. So can't necessarily do this on their own without larger support. And it's been opened up to NGOs to join in other organizations. They initially asked whether I would lead that whole NGO organization side and try to figure out how do we connect the NGOs to this. They were expecting maybe 50 from around the world to express interest. 2,608 did within the first period of expressions of interest to this event. So completely scrapped what was going to happen. And they're now having this whole other thing for civil society. So now I'm back in the diplomacy side for this, but we're really trying to figure out what this roadmap is moving forward to get off of fossil fuels. And whether it goes back to the UN process or not remains to sort of be an outcome of this. So this is just two pictures of on the glaciers or getting, and then two pictures of the Paramo ecosystem that's just highly vulnerable. That, as I said, it's covers 3% of Colombia, but feeds water for about 70% of the country. So I think I will leave it there. It's probably just over my half hour, but I will open it to questions.
That's great. Thank you,
Thank you very
Susana.
much.
Yep, thank you. So we have a question on
And
sea
if you
level
want,
rise
yes.
implications. And to what degree are we really taking glacial melt projections into consideration in Maine's local coastal flooding projections? Are you,
Yes.
man, do you do
Super.
any consulting here in Maine
I don't do
aside
too
from with
much.
us?
I don't do too much, but I do a little bit in some places of the world, certainly. So, with some mostly national governments, but we're trying to get more. We're interested in more getting into the subnational governments, and so yes, do some of the consulting around the world. Have been working on a project with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and Northeastern University on local sea level rise.
Hmm.
We're piloting it right now, mostly in the greater Portland area, but it's something that we have all the materials to make it across the coast. It's just three of us who are working on this are all local, and we were like, let's do a really local thing so that we can figure out how it can be used and who wants to use it, and if we can make something at the hyper local level so that it's accessible to people who say might want to buy a house or or having a business, and is it okay if I have this water pump in this exact location. So we're trying to see how local we could really make it, and then can expand it. We know that the Gulf of Maine is particularly vulnerable. It is for a handful of reasons. It's shallow, it's C-shaped. We're getting changes in the Labrador currents. Greenland's the melt of Greenland is directly affecting us with a lot of freshening of water. It's changing the density. It's changing our food systems. So it's a very vulnerable spot that we're seeing a lot of changes. So there's a lot of interest in that area, and it's a pretty cool body of water because it is changing really quickly. But so yes, glacier impacts are there. Could be more, but they're pretty well known what those are.
And could you make any references to possible mitigations as far as slowing down the melting of the glaciers and planetary heating? Have you come
Getting off of
across
fossil
things?
fuels would be a start.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think we all agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, mitigations that are potential, okay, on a level that you find yourself working at a lot of the time.
Yeah. So we're looking, so there are a couple different things that I'm looking at specifically. One is, yeah, sort of getting the world's large economies, or at the large scale, getting us off of fossil fuels, because many of us who want to be off fossil fuels on a personal level don't have the capacity to, because we're in this bigger system. So there's certainly that I'm working on a lot. I'm also working on some of the sort of what we call nature-based solutions. So you
Hmm.
may have heard of, planting mangroves in certain areas to protect against coastal erosion and sea level rise. But something like mangroves, actually, they do a lot, and they're very great in many parts of the world, but they actually only work for a certain amount of sea level rise, for example, and we can easily overpower those, and we're on track to do so very quickly. So here locally, we talk a bit about the marshlands and having marshes and grasses in the water that can have, huge benefits, but are also only good for a certain period. So ultimately, I think the big one that we need to have is the remote getting off of fossil fuels.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Cliff, you have a question? You've raised your hand.
Yes. Um, Appreciate your time, Susanna.
Thank you.
Um, which areas on regions of the planet would you say are the most climate sensitive to any human impacts?
Wow,
Are the
that's a huge
most sensitive, are the most sensitive
that's a huge question, and it's question because most sensitive.
to human impacts?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you have something like, Antarctica that's hugely sensitive, but also, it's got about 50 something meters of potential sea level rise in it as well. So the impacts that it has on the rest of the world are obviously huge as well.
That's an
But
extreme you're talking about, an extreme place. Yep.
yeah, no, no, exactly.
So maybe the extreme places?
But it could be some of the extreme places. They're changing very rapidly as a direct result of humans without really humans necessarily really being there.
This,
But changing
this
very
is
rapidly. So
so this is a two-part question. The second part would be through your studies, it's quite obvious that you've discovered, or the world now knows, the Arctic and Greenland is heating 3 to 7 times faster than the rest of the planet. Is there a reason why that's happening for the polar regions in the northern hemisphere? What would you see do you see any human impacts that might have had an effect in those regions
so
over
yes.
the years?
Yeah, so there's several. That's a good question as sort of why the polar regions are particularly vulnerable from human impacts. And one is quite simply, and one reason that they're quite important, and I probably should have said that, is that they are in many ways sort of our global refrigerator, so to speak. They're generally white. Uh, One of the big issues with the Arctic ice melting is that we're getting what we're called Arctic darken, or sort of the darkening of this area. White surfaces reflect a lot of light. They're great to keep things cool. Talk about wearing a white shirt on a summer day, or people who are painting their roofs white to reflect sunlight. It's great to keep things cool. When the white ocean ice is replaced by a dark ocean, it absorbs water and it absorbs heat. So it can actually accelerate warming. So what we end up with, we have several of these positive feedback loops that the more ice that melts, the more heat is absorbed, and therefore more ice melts. And we see this with permafrost thaw as well, where permafrost thaw has the capacity to be on par as a net emitter with a country like China, for example. And we don't talk about the capacity of something like permafrost to thaw and release these decaying microorganisms that are in the soils. But it's huge. And the more we warm this up, the more thaw that happens, the more emissions that happen, and therefore the more that we warm. So we get these cycles. So that's one of the reasons that these regions are such a big player. And we also one of the things we talk about, something like black carbon, which is just soot. So that can be soot from a passing ship. It can be soot from a wildfire. It can be soot from whatever, car exhaust. But, when that gets into the Arctic, which it does through air and water, air currents mainly, it is black material on white surface, and that creates the absorption of heat, and that creates melting. So we lose the ice from something like that. And, we're able to track soot. So if we see it somewhere, we're able to figure out exactly pretty much where it came from. And we're able to do that with microplastics that we find in some coral reef somewhere. We can know exactly which bottling plant that came from, which is contentious because, you're starting to hold people accountable that way in ways that groups don't necessarily want. But we are able to say that, this wildfire, we could track how much, a couple of years ago when we had big wildfires in Canada, how much ice loss in Greenland that actually led to, for example. So it's probably one of the regions that when we talk about something turning green and the more greenery growing there is actually, we talk about it actually as a bad thing. So I like to think that green areas are nice and forests are nice, but when they happen in places that should be white, it has a huge warming impact on the world. So I don't know if that answers your question a bit, but
That's the beginning, but
all right.
I have a lot more, but I know other people may have questions.
I
Sorry.
just sent in a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Marianne.
Oh, there are rivers that flow into the Arctic from dams, and the water released from the dams is warmer as a result of, collecting sunshine during the year or whatever. What is the thinking about how much impact that might be having on the Arctic?
Yeah. So I hesitate to say with too much absoluteness because I'm not 100% certain, but certainly generally in favor of, well, it does have an impact. It has an impact in that the water is different temperature. The water definitely usually has, has changed itself in the fact that it's warmed. So, certainly, we're seeing changes in fish populations, for example, in dammed rivers, not just the absence of fish, but the ability of fish to survive in warmer waters when they are dammed, the different species. So we are seeing in some areas changes in fish populations, fish spawning abilities in some of these either Arctic places or glaciated rivers in other parts of the world as a result of damming. So that is something we are seeing, and we're seeing sort of a net negative impact having the dams, and seeing that when the dams are removed, that is a positive thing for keeping the ecosystem stable.
Yeah. That's a tough row to hoe,
Yes.
getting dams removed. Susanna, I want to ask you
Not
about,
built.
Sorry, Mariana?
I said, or not built. There are plans for more and more.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
also an interesting one because in some areas where they have a lot of rivers, they see dams they define dam or hydroelectricity as a renewable resource. And one of the areas where I've been probably most involved in that is we have what we call, as I mentioned, these glacier lake outburst floods, where you'll have some events, and it could be a permafrost thaw leading to a landslide. It can be just excessive precipitation, lots of different things, some extra melt, and you get these glacier lakes that are basically near a glacier, and they will suddenly burst and run down this river and wipe out a dam, for example. And somebody I was talking with in one of the major World Bank, or one of the major development banks a couple months ago, and they were saying that usually in the development world, you talk about dams as, the risks to dams, forgetting they don't even talk about the biodiversity impacts, but the risks being either having too much water and overflowing the dam, or not having enough water and basically having it being dead water. And they said, when you start bringing in the glaciers or the Arctic aspect of that, you suddenly have to bring in these outburst floods. And then you're talking about now the risk isn't too much water or not enough water. Now the risk is you've destroyed the whole thing, and and partially as a result of having it been there, you destroy communities below it as well. And they invest in the money in having these, but they don't invest in warning systems. They're not necessarily built well enough to withstand these impacts, but also if they were built better, they might be more resilient to these impacts, but they would also be better for the environment, biodiversity as well. So they were kind of using the Arctic and the glacier side as a reason not to have the dams, because it's just the risk of catastrophe is so much higher.
I heard they're planning to build a dam in Greenland that would take advantage of melting glaciers, which sounds
Yes.
really horrible.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
Okay. Coming back to you in just a second, Cliff, I wanted to ask Susana first about what you think are the most effective educational media, educational vectors, educational organizations around to get a message like what you're sharing with us here out to more people, because I mean, some of the things that you've mentioned are pretty. I never knew that, 85% of the world's population, is affected by what's going on with the glaciers. That's remarkable.
Yeah. I can share some links with you. I want to make sure that I get some names
Okay.
correct. So I can certainly follow up. But there's some good materials. There's some good podcasts out recently.
Mhm.
There is a push in trying to make educational material a little bit more chunk sized and accessible, so that it's not having to read big reports. But I think one of the big interests that I have in my work is that I get to play on the ice, and I get to do a lot of the actual analysis and science and write it. I've had a couple of papers that I've had out fairly recently that are sort of classic scientific papers, but then saying, no, I want to do something with this, because one of the big frustrations for me with science is that, and this is part of grant writing, this is part of how our whole science tends to work, is that you write something and then you publish it and you put it out somewhere and it sits on the shelf and it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't really affect policy. It doesn't change the way that we live or work. So being at that nexus of the science and the policy for me is really quite interesting, because I feel like I get to actually do something with the science and try to figure out how to turn science into something. And being in that sphere, I've been able to work with a handful of people who are educators and are communicators and translate that. And there's some really fantastic work that has been done that targets that exactly. But
I
in
look
ways
forward
that
to
don't require
seeing
you
it.
to go look up some random paper somewhere on
Right.
JSTOR. So
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Becky?
Susanna, I have laryngitis, so I hope you can understand me.
All good. Thanks, Becky.
Um, I am, that we've been working about the Canadian dams for some time, because you and I have talked about it in the past. I'm curious. There are two things. One, there's a plan for another dam on the Grand River that at Gull Island that is already, causing a lot of consternation. And I just wonder that particular dam, has got to be impacting the Labrador Current. And I'm just wondering, as all of them are, I'm wondering, has there been any discussion about that kind of impact to, the whole ecology of the ocean in in the policy areas, or is there any, movement towards controlling some of this advance of controlling all the rivers? I mean, so many of them are already dammed. So anyway.
Yeah. No, thank you, Becky. There, I haven't. Nothing has escalated to sort of the higher echelons of that conversation.
What was the last word you
There
said?
should be people that I can think of who should be talking about that and should be doing something, and they might be, but it hasn't percolated above that. So I I would have some ideas of who I would talk to if I were to want to know how something like Gull Island is being discussed, but I haven't been included in those conversations. So
Well, it would be great for us to have access to some of those people. We may not be able to have access, but we can certainly try.
yeah. We can follow up
Great,
if you want to.
great.
Yeah, that would be great. And I haven't. Yeah, I'd have to. Yeah, we can follow up.
I guess my other question was just about the blackness of the enormous reservoirs in the Arctic and the impact not only of water vapor, but also just the heat sink that those
Yeah.
provide.
No, that's a huge concern, and that's one of the. I mean, whether that's dammed or whether that's not. I mean, that's just bringing more dark color to an area that we really want to reflect light,
Hmm.
and that's opened itself up to a fair bit of some of the geoengineering proposals that are a completely different topic, but there has been a lot of work looking into just the impacts of large areas that are dark, such as reservoirs, and that's
Thank you, Becky.
quantifiable. So
Yep. We're going to Elizabeth Lee next, and then we'll probably wrap up with, I see Cliff has his hand raised again.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm from Canada, and I have lived and been everywhere across Canada. But BC and Alberta are the ones I can really say that what I found out recently that all the northern rivers across Canada and all their tributaries have been dammed. So that tells me that there's no such thing as this wild river that we talk about so much. It used to be. And when I heard they were expanding on what's on the Gull Island, like the apparently how the money goes, I don't know who's benefiting because it's certainly not Newfoundland, but I do know in the Peace River watershed, it's got 3 dams on it now, and it's all about for energy, it's for big business, and who else all knows. But in that area, that impacted the indigenous people horrendously. And to this day, they pay them to get a tractor out and to where the river used to be is like all sediment. And so they have this tractor that makes it so it doesn't just blow constantly to Fort St. John. And it's just insatiable, this whole thing about electricity and cheap energy. Well, it's not cheap at all. It never has been cheap. I have never, if like I have seen wild rivers, and I don't care if I don't go to look at dams. I saw them as a child, and I saw them once, and I said I thought they were the most terrible things I'd ever seen. And what Canada has done, it just because that's what Canada does. It's got no brains at all. I'm sorry. It's just it broke my heart when I heard that. Can you all the tributaries too, not just like the like in example when they did the last one at the not the one that just did Site C, but the one before that, when they did it, it took away the spring melt that was scientifically for the delta, the Athabasca Delta, and it was dying the delta. And so they BC wouldn't do it. So finally now they have a little bit of a melt goes, and instantly the delta came back to life. And so there's no even, well, we do this, but we'll make sure we'll help you if something goes wrong. No, it's like the fossil fuel. They don't care. It's just that
yeah,
simple.
no,
Yeah.
and I think I don't know that I have too much to add to that. I mean, it's so much of this is climate colonialism, and seeing that around the world, who has power, who has money, and I've been in a couple conversations and high level conversations, like lawsuit type things about about, yeah, people with power who can do something and they need an area to test something out. So where do they choose to test it? They choose an indigenous land. Why? Because nobody lives there, as they say, and they can get that through, and somebody gives them money to do it, and they go ahead and do it, and they don't necessarily be honest. They're not necessarily honest about what they're doing. We're seeing, kids who are being diagnosed, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds who are being diagnosed with skin cancer because, somebody's changed the atmosphere right over them. And yeah, there's so many moving parts. But I think you also mentioned about the Delta coming back, and all of these ecosystems are so resilient to a degree, of course, that when we can remove dams, when we can even get a little bit, we've seen it, I spoke a lot about Greenland melt. When we get just a little bit more snow, or the melt is delayed by even a week or so, it has huge impacts. So, little benefits, whether it's, just a single dam removal or more, obviously, I mean, they can pay off dividends quite well. But I think it's that bigger picture also of taking advantage of people. And I probably, after about a week or two of being in Greenland on the ice, all I wanted was fresh vegetables and some milky tea. And I got to the other end, got to a little town, and basically Greenland, I mean, as many of you know, probably with their relationship with Denmark, and what the US is trying to take advantage of that is very contentious relationship. Denmark controls a lot of access to their food that's not subsistence feeding, but it's hard to have subsistence hunting when the ice is melting and it's not safe, or the animals aren't there. So I walk into this market, and they had signs on the freezer doors saying that they were expecting food a month ago. It's not here. Don't ask us about it. We have no answers for you. And at the same time, so they didn't have any fresh food. They didn't have any fresh vegetables. They had some, canned veg if I wanted it. And at the same time, they have liters and liters. I mean, not liters, 5-gallon jugs of what we would maybe think of for a jerry can for gasoline of Coca-Cola. I mean, that's what you get. I mean, my friend and I walked in there. We thought it was blue windshield washer fluid. It was blue soda. And it's just these jerry cans of this. And that's what, we pass off as food. And we can do that because we have these, these relationships, these power structures. And so we're seeing that just across the board, whether that's with the damming of rivers, who can make money off of other people. So, yeah, huge issue. And I'm excited that a lot of you are passionate about the dams here too.
You can bet on that. Thank you.
I've heard a bit about it from Halsey and Becky. So,
and you'll hear more, I'm sure. We're going to wrap up now. So I want to say thank you very much, Susana, for sharing this with us, your work, your trips, your perspective on everything. And we hope we can continue the conversation at another time.
Yeah.
And I look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, Susana.
Thank you.
It was very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.